Coming up, electric school buses at the Eastern Band of Cherokee. EPA Administrator Michael Regan is here to share more. And we're featuring entrepreneur Ruth-Ann Thorn during Women's History Month. Plus, we learn about a discrimination lawsuit filed by a Native educator. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start in Washington, D.C., where nearly $9 million is being awarded to 13 Indigenous and Alaska Native nations, all in an effort to help with renewable energy. The U.S. Department of Energy is funding 14 different projects to reduce energy costs and increase energy security on tribal lands. The projects will provide clean electricity to 1,200 residential buildings that lack electricity and increase job training opportunities. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm weighed in on the move, saying, "Tribal communities are imbued with knowledge and ingenuity around sustainable energy infrastructure, and they are poised to help lead the country as we make an equitable transition to clean." Granholm invited Native leaders to a virtual session at the end of March to help develop 60 new programs. In California, a plan is underway that would give $100 million to Indigenous leaders to help buy back ancestral lands. The proposal is part of Governor Gavin Newsom's pledge to preserve 1/3 of the state's lands and coastal waters by 2030. And it also comes amid a growing land back movement to return Indigenous lands to tribes. Aside from buying land, nations in California could also use the money to address climate change and workforce development. Kusla Kessler-Mata, a member of the state's Truth and Healing Council, says there should be more thought towards process and infrastructure.
We're really looking at the need for a systematic approach by the government to help map and identify all of the potential overlapping claims, as well as the kind of cultural claims where we could have co-management, perhaps models, consortium models, agreements put in place amongst tribal communities.
State lawmakers would first have to approve the spending before it could happen. Well, more companies are producing reports on ESG, which stands for Environment, Social, and Governance, and these standards are used to measure how well a company is doing in its impact on climate change. The government is now proposing to make that system of producing ESG reports mandatory for publicly traded companies. The rule change would require publicly traded companies to treat climate change as a material risk. Rebecca Adamson is a former trustee with the Calvert Impact Fund and has experience in this. She says calls for protecting the climate are important to younger generations.
And the millennial and Gen Z have been really carrying the torch on this stuff. The last survey that I think Bloomberg or one of these guys did talked about they are absolutely demanding that planet and people be factored into these decisions.
The comment period will be open for the next 60 days before the rule becomes final. About 4 years ago, Monica Navumsa combined her love of painting with a childhood pastime. That pastime was putting jigsaw puzzles together with her grandmother. As Patty Thalahongva reports, Navumsa is now turning her paintings into jigsaw puzzles with a unique native flair.
So this one here is called Ancestry. It represents all of my tribes, Hopi, Acoma, and Havasupai. And the design represents where I draw my strengths.
Monica Navumsa grew up on the Hopi Reservation in Arizona. She has fond memories of putting together puzzles with her so'o, her grandmother.
It was a really, really nice memory, and I decided to make a puzzle series not long after my grandmother passed away. It was my way of keeping her close.
Monica turned her paintings into these unique puzzles, like this one that shows frogs singing on a lily pad.
But we do have riparian areas, and I've seen those places on Hopi, and those are places that represent what we pray for in the rain.
At a recent art market in Phoenix, this young boy diligently worked on a puzzle. They're only about 7 inches in diameter.
His sister was standing here next to him saying he loves puzzles. He's always fixing puzzles at home, and he's standing there and he looks at me and says, "This is a real challenge."
This is not her main job. Nuvamsa is the executive director of the Hopi Foundation, a nonprofit with a budget of $1.2 million. She oversees several programs, including Hopi radio station KUYI.
How's your business going?
It's still a hobby.
So far, she's made enough to cover expenses, and she's not in a rush. Like that young boy, she's diligently working to get her puzzles into gift shops that have ties to ancestral sites. In Phoenix, Patty Tholhungva, ICT News.
And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, more than 9 million women are business owners in the U.S. We'll meet Ruth-Ann Thorn, a Luiseno woman who is running several businesses of her own. And later, he is the first cabinet member to join the ICT Newscast. We're joined by the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. We'll be right back. According to the Small Business Administration, women own more than 9 million businesses, and Ruth-Ann Thorn is included in that number. For years, she's been an entrepreneur in San Diego. Her businesses have included art galleries and a skincare beauty line. In 2018, she was elected the chairwoman of the Regan Economic Development Corporation that oversees her tribe's businesses. As we continue to celebrate Women's History Month, we welcome Ruth-Ann Thorn to our newscast. Hello, and great to see you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a really great honor.
I'm really curious, when you were growing up, did you ever see yourself as an entrepreneur?
That's an interesting question. I think when you're a child, you don't really think about what it is you're going to be until much later. And so in retrospect, I think I always had a good hustle because, as a Native person, that's what we kind of had to do just to survive. I saw it all around me with my grandparents that had a beautiful orange orchard and just a lot of work. So we really had a work ethic, but I guess I see it now, but it took me a minute to recognize it.
I'm really curious. I talked a little bit already about your businesses, but can you tell us in more detail about what those have been and maybe what you've enjoyed working on the most?
Well, probably the lion's share of my business has been in the art world. So I started in the art world professionally in 1988, working at an art gallery. And then that really got me inspired because of my background. So I have a kind of I wouldn't say shady, but a very interesting background that led me into the art world. But I felt like art was a very healing type of an industry to be in. And I really needed that after, going through some trauma. And that was a launching off part for me in my lifetime. And so 31 years later, I've been in the art world.
Data actually shows that women, and particularly women of color, are least likely to pursue a career in entrepreneurism because they don't have a fallback plan. Is that something that you experienced?
I don't think I did. And I think that has to do with the fact that I'm Native American. So when you think about the history of who we are as Native people, 100 million people on this northern continent, now we're the smallest minority group in the United States. We have had such resistance to everything. It's really in our DNA to push forward. So I moved out of the house at 14 years old, and I have technically a 9th grade education. And so you had to really learn how to overcome obstacles. And I think that's the foundation of being an entrepreneur. So, and once you've really faced the worst, I mean, I've been homeless, I've had, a lot of obstacles. Once you hit rock bottom, it removes fear because you realize, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? And that is kind of a funny idea, but that's what I think entrepreneurs have to face, that fear at some point, that, like you had said, there's no safety net when you're an entrepreneur. However, for me personally, in retrospect, I think it's actually the strongest foundation of security, job security, when you're creating your own job, because you're not dependent on a company to make the right choices.
If you were speaking to a Native woman who wanted to make a jump and start a business and go out and pursue something they hadn't before, what would be the one message that you send to them?
Well, it would depend on what it was that they wanted to pursue. So obviously, certain careers really require a certain level of education. So if you wanted to be a doctor, you definitely need to go to school. But if you want to own a business, let's say you want to go into the restaurant business, my feeling is skip the MBA and go bus tables and work your way up and learn every single aspect of what it is to run a restaurant. Like, go through from, washing the dishes to serving the people to working in the kitchen, because that hands-on experience is really going to give you the base. And then you can go hire someone to do a business plan. Get somebody who has that expertise and maybe learn a little bit about finance, but, in your business, structure yourself with people that are smarter than you, but learn the overall foundation of whatever it is that you're interested in.
Ruth, we only have about a minute left, but in the women that we've been highlighting for Women's History Month, we've asked all of them who was an inspirational role model to them. So I'd love to ask you the same question. Who were women that you looked up to?
Oh boy, there's so many of them, but I would say probably my aunties on the reservation. I've learned a lot about the resilience. They were all really hardworking women. Obviously, my mom, who's an artist, who has inspired me. But I think, the foundation, there's not just one woman. I think I've taken things from women all over, but the main thing that I see about women is our ability to overcome and be problem solvers. And if you're going to be successful in life, you really need to learn how to problem solve and then make decisions and then stick with that. So I think women are really good at executing.
I would agree with you. Well, Ruth-Ann Thorn, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
A new grant from the Environmental Protection Agency resulted in the purchase of an electric school bus on the lands of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The bus was a first for the tribal nation and a first for the entire state of North Carolina. Joining us today is the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan. He will outline this and other initiatives the EPA is working on in Native communities. Administrator Regan, welcome to the ICT Newscast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here today.
So let's just jump right in and talk about your trip to North Carolina with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Tell us about these electric school buses.
It was a wonderful event, and I always love going back home to my home state of North Carolina. I have a standing relationship with Chief Sneed of the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And so to go back home and make this announcement was just wonderful. The first electric school bus in the state of North Carolina. I'm so proud of Chief Sneed's leadership, but we were also able to announce, thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, that we're adding 4 additional electric school buses to their fleet. And so it was a wonderful event, and it's great to see that leadership from our tribal nations.
I'm really curious why it was important to you personally to make sure that they had electric school buses. I've heard you say this before, that you think that it's important for children to have clean air to breathe. So can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. All of our children should have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. And when we think about the time that our children, our precious cargo, spend on these yellow school buses, their exposure to diesel emissions is too high and too frequent. And these electric school buses present an opportunity for our children to safely travel to school. And when they get to school, not have to contend with an asthma attack or some sort of respiratory distress, but the ability to breathe fresh, clean air, go into the school, and really tackle that educational opportunity. I was so honored to be a part of the unveiling with Chief Snead and the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And I'm just excited that thanks to the president's leadership, the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA will have $5 billion to award to communities all across this country to invest in low emissions and electric school buses. It's an exciting time for us.
And do you expect other tribal nations to use that funding to implement these electric school buses in their own communities?
Absolutely. We've been having conversations from day one, government to government, with so many tribal nations all across the country. And from clean air to clean water, electric school buses, super fun water infrastructure, we have so many opportunities for so much engagement. And I don't expect that electric school buses will be any different from the other opportunities that we're going to pursue together.
Aside from your trip to North Carolina recently, I understand that you also traveled to another tribal nation. Tell us about that experience and the announcements that you unveiled there.
You know, I firmly believe that we have to get outside of Washington, D.C. and engage with our stakeholders. And the president has made it clear that the government-to-government tribal nation engagements are a top priority. So in the first year, I traveled to Navajo Nation and spent some time with President Nez, just looking at the abandoned mine issue up close and personal, seeing the community impacts and having conversations with many of the tribal nation members about what these abandoned mines mean to them. And I'll tell you, it was so touching to hear the personal stories and understand the health implications of living near these abandoned mines. But some of the stories about having to remind children not to play with the yellow rocks, which we know are remnants of these mines and so toxic, really touched me, because we want to protect our children in every way possible. And so having that visit and those, government to government conversations really armed me with the type of information I needed to bring back to Washington so we can put the proper mechanisms in place to protect public health.
And will you be making any additional trips to tribal lands anytime soon?
Absolutely. It's my goal to visit with as many tribal nations and leaders as possible. We know that we cannot solve these complex issues if we don't have robust conversations. I was excited to be with National Tribal Council member Gerald Lewis recently to talk about the listing of the Bradford Island Superfund site on our national priorities list. 7 nations have been advocating for that listing for so long. And so my goal is to meet with as many tribal nations and tribal leaders, solve as many complex problems as possible, but more importantly, with the $60 billion that will funnel through EPA as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law for water infrastructure, school buses, and Superfund sites, we want as much of that money to reach our tribal nations as possible.
We only have about a minute left, but while you're here, I want to talk about the environmental justice grants that tribes can apply for. Tell us about that.
We're so excited. $1.6 million in tribal grants that will be awarded soon. We have decided that in the past, so many of our grants have gone to so many people over and over and over, and we want to expand, cast a wider net. Our tribal partners are so important, and environmental justice and equity is a central part of this administration. from the president on down. And so we're excited to be able to administer these resources. And that's just the beginning. The bipartisan infrastructure law is going to provide a once in a generation opportunity for us to invest billions and billions of dollars together. And I'm excited to have the tribal nation partnerships.
Well, EPA Administrator Michael Regan, thank you so much for joining us, and please come back again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
From education to federal Indian boarding schools, Source New Mexico senior reporter Sean Griswold has had his hands full. He joins us today to talk about his latest reporting. Hi, Sean, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in. I want to talk about the story that you filed about this discrimination lawsuit filed by a Native educator. Set the scene for us.
Yes, so Central Consolidated School District is based in the Four Corners in New Mexico, serves a predominant Native American population, has several schools that are on the Navajo Nation. In 2021, the school district hired an interim superintendent named Dave Goldtooth. And Dr. Goldtooth was the district's very first superintendent who was fluent in the Navajo language and was seen like a pretty big accomplishment for representation and leadership for the school district. Dr. Goldtooth had started to conduct a lot of community outreach. He was one of the first superintendents to bring in and foster conversations between the school district, the border towns, and the chapter houses. And so like the outreach he was doing was seemingly significant. But the leadership for the Central Consolidated School District, non-Native peoples, started to what he lines out in a lawsuit, a level of micromanagement that ultimately led to retaliation that led to him losing his job within the year of holding the position. So he filed the lawsuit claiming retaliation from the district, as well as the hostile work environment that school leadership, particularly school board members, as well as the school district acting attorney were causing for him in his job. And his case is now moving forward. A judge recently denied a motion to dismiss that the school district attempted to do and trying to end the case in their effort. So the case is moving forward to a trial unless the district would like to settle with Dr. Goldtooth.
Sean, what is the school district's response to this lawsuit? Are they basically claiming that they didn't do all of the things that Dr. Goldtooth said that they did?
Yeah, that's the stance they're taking. They're claiming that like the issue for the micromanagement that he alleges the district, claims that it was sort of part of the process to get Dr. Goldtooth up to speed, and that they were trying to, do the best practices so he'd be able to fulfill the duties of his job. And they also deny like the characterization of the issues of racism that Dr. Goldtooth alleges happens in the district. But there's also something to that when it comes to the characterization of how Native people are treated within the district versus non-Native employees. And that's heard from several other people who also work in the district, teachers and educators, parents as well, have come out in support for Dr. Goldtooth, who say they've had similar experiences, but have been afraid to speak up. And even Dr. Goldtooth himself, before he filed the lawsuit, was pretty timid in presenting these allegations. But because the case is moving forward, it's now set for the trial. He discusses in this latest article about feeling empowered and other people coming up to him who are thanking him for speaking up against the district that they've had many bad experiences with.
Let's actually keep talking about that, because this discrimination lawsuit comes amid the backdrop of a larger education lawsuit in New Mexico called Yazi versus Martinez. And that essentially says that Native students are among a larger group of people who aren't getting a good education in the state of New Mexico. How do you think that this lawsuit plays into Yazi versus Martinez?
And this is also cited in the lawsuit. Dr. Goldtooth's argument is that his position as a leader, as a superintendent, the top job in a school district, is indication that you're creating progress and meeting the goals of the Yazi Martinez settlement, which one of them is to provide a better learning experience for Indigenous students. And his leadership, his perspective, even his grasp of language, of the traditional language for his student population, is something that he argues overall benefits not only his position, but for the position of all the students at Central Consolidated, the Native students and non-Indigenous students. And so in a way, his lawsuit and his experience is another example that we don't hear too much about, because there's also not very many Native American leadership in school settings. That's obviously something the state's trying to remedy. But he was the very first fluent Navajo language superintendent in this district's history. And since he's left, the school district hired a non-Native superintendent who actually left about a month ago. And the replacement for them is another non-Native person. And so Dr. Goldtooth is arguing, we need more people like myself in these leadership positions.
Well, Sean, we'll continue to cover this through your reporting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.